Johnny Cash had 4 months left, and he knew it. He was sitting in the front pew at his wife's funeral on May 15th, 2003, and the people in the room who loved him were trying not to let him see them calculating. 4 months, maybe less. The diabetes, the nerve damage, the autonomic neuropathy that had been taking him apart piece by piece. None of it had stopped for the funeral, and none of it was going to. He had outlasted everyone's expectations already. That had always been true of him. What almost no one in that room knew was that somewhere in those pews sat the one man Cash had ever been fully honest with. Not his manager, not his closest friends, not even, in certain matters, his wife. A tall man with white hair who had spent 30 years listening to things Johnny Cash could not say to anyone else, and who had never, not once, said them to anyone. This is the story of what it costs a man to carry everything alone, and what it means when he finally finds the one person he doesn't have to. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the most recognizable men in America. The voice, the black clothes, the presence on a stage that made other performers look like they were merely standing in rooms. He had recorded at Sun Studio alongside Elvis. He had sold millions of records. He was also coming apart. The amphetamine addiction that began in the late 1950s had become something he could not manage. He was taking pills to perform and pills to sleep and pills to get through the hours in between, crashing cars, missing concerts, disappearing into stretches of time he couldn't account for afterward. In 1967, he was arrested near the Tennessee-Georgia border with nearly 1,000 pills in his pockets. He had been crawling through a ditch in the dark. He was not a man who asked for help easily, but something in him, by the early 1970s, understood that what he had been doing alone was not working. The precise moment Cash and Graham first met is not recorded with certainty. What is documented is that by the early 1970s, they were in genuine contact, and that the connection deepened quickly into something neither had expected. On the surface, they had little in common. Graham was the most influential evangelical preacher in American history, a man who had counseled presidents, preached to more people in person than anyone alive, whose public life was one of sustained institutional authority. Cash was a man who had been thrown out of churches, who wore black, he said, for the poor and the prisoner, and the ones nobody prayed for. And yet, Graham had an instinct for meeting people where they were, rather than where he thought they should be. Cash recognized it immediately. Most men of Graham's stature, in Cash's experience, had something they wanted from him. Graham simply wanted to talk. That was the whole of it at first. Two men sitting across a table, one famous for saving souls, the other famous for losing his, finding out they could speak plainly to each other. Cash had spent years carefully managing what different people were allowed to know about him. His record label knew about the missed shows. His family knew about some of the worst periods. His manager knew what the machinery required. The public knew the redemption arc, the comeback narrative that kept getting restarted because it had a satisfying shape. Almost no one knew all of it, the full inventory, the relapses that followed the recoveries, the periods when he'd convinced everyone, including himself, that he had it controlled, and then didn't. Graham became the person he told. By multiple accounts from people who knew both men, Cash was candid with Graham about his addiction in ways he was rarely candid with anyone. Not confessional in a performative sense. Honest in the way you are, only with someone you've decided, for reasons you can't fully explain, to trust completely. Graham received it without flinching. He did not advise beyond what was asked. He listened in the way very few people in Cash's life had ever managed, without an agenda waiting on the other side of the silence. Here is what makes that significant. Billy Graham was one of the most scrutinized men in America for most of his adult life. His associations mattered. What he said about people mattered. He had learned through painful experience, including the Nixon-era Watergate tapes that exposed private conversations he deeply regretted, exactly how much damage a disclosed confidence could do. He was also surrounded, always, by people who wrote things down. None of what Cash told him appears in any of it. Not in Graham's memoirs, not in authorized biographies, not in any interview across a public career that stretched into his 90s. The specific content of what Cash disclosed, the relapses, the darkness, the things he could not say elsewhere, stayed exactly where Cash had put it, for 30 years. In a culture that treats disclosure as currency, where you reveal things in exchange for sympathy or the comfort of being publicly known, Graham's silence was something close to a countercultural act. Cash understood exactly what it cost. It was, by all accounts, the foundation of everything between them. The friendship was not without strain. Cash's recovery was not linear. There were periods in the late 1970s and into the 1980s when he relapsed, sometimes quietly, sometimes visibly enough to reach the press. Years when the television show was gone. The record sales had dropped, and the comeback narrative kept having to be restarted. These were not easy years to be close to him. People who loved Cash found themselves watching someone they could not save make choices they could not stop. Graham did not withdraw. This is worth sitting with. Graham had an enormous amount to protect: his reputation, his ministry, his institutional standing. Other people in Cash's orbit during these years managed their proximity carefully, leaving themselves room to step back. If things worsened, he did not stay loudly. He made no point of it publicly. He simply remained available, the calls continuing, the visits when possible, the quality of attention unchanged by whatever Cash had most recently done or failed to do. That kind of loyalty has a specific weight. Cash knew exactly what it was worth. In 1993, a producer named Rick Rubin called Johnny Cash. Rubin had built his name working with hip-hop and heavy metal. He had never produced a country record. What he had was an instinct that the real Cash, the one underneath the career and the catalog, had never been properly recorded. They made American recordings in Cash's living room, just Cash and an acoustic guitar, and songs chosen because they meant something. Critics who had written him off discovered him as an artist. A generation that had never heard of him found him. Cash was 61 years old. What the reviews didn't capture is what Cash knew privately about his own condition. The physical deterioration that would accelerate through the late 1990s had already begun. He understood at some level that this was not a second act. It was a final statement. He kept recording anyway. 5 albums in 10 years. He performed as long as he could stand. And he kept talking to Graham. The comeback transformed the public story. The private one, the real inventory of what he was carrying, remained between the same two people it had always been between. June Carter Cash died on May 15, 2003, following complications from heart valve surgery. She was 73. She had been the organizing principle of Cash's survival, not sentimentally, structurally. She found him in the worst of it and made a decision she was not going to reverse. She married him in 1968, knowing exactly what she was taking on. Cash said more than once that June saved his life. He was not speaking metaphorically. Less discussed, is what her presence made possible between Cash and Graham. June understood the friendship. She knew there were things Cash said to Graham he did not say to her, and she had made peace with that because she understood what it meant for a man like Cash to have one place where he could set things down completely. When she died, that structure collapsed. 9 days later, Cash recorded a music video for the song Hurt. He could barely hold the guitar. The camera did not look away. It may be the most honest document of grief ever put on film. Billy Graham flew to Tennessee for the funeral. Graham was 74 when he sat in that church in Hendersonville. He was not well himself. Parkinson's disease had been progressing for years. He moved carefully. He had his own diminishment to navigate. He came anyway. What passed between Cash and Graham that day is not recorded. There is no account of a conversation, no letter, no description of a private moment. What is documented is that Graham was there, present in the way he had been present for 30 years. Cash died 4 months later, on September 12, 2003. Respiratory failure, complicated by diabetes. He was 71. He spent those 4 months continuing to record. He finished enough material for 2 more posthumous albums. He did not stop until he could not. Whether he and Graham spoke in those final weeks is not part of any public record. Given 30 years of evidence, the assumption is not a difficult one. Some things don't need to be documented to be understood. Most friendships of this kind never get told because they were never meant to be told. That is precisely what made this one real. Johnny Cash lived a life of extraordinary public visibility. Every relapse, every recovery, every reinvention was absorbed into a narrative the public owned as much as he did. He was a figure, not just a man, and figures do not get to have things that belong only to them. Except that he had this: 30 years of a friendship conducted almost entirely outside public view. 30 years of a man who knew the full inventory and treated it as a private trust. 30 years of not having to perform or explain or manage the story. Graham outlived Cash by 14 years. He died in 2018 at 99. In all of that time, across all the interviews and memoirs and reflections on a career that touched virtually every major figure of the 20th century, he said nothing specific about what Cash had told him. He kept it all the way to the end. He kept it. Every man who carries something heavy needs one person who will never put it down anywhere else. Johnny Cash found that person. Most people never do. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands what that kind of loyalty costs.